Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Princeton Preservation Group's conversation with Julia Fell. It's going to be a great evening. My name is Melissa Ziobro. I'm the Specialist Professor of Public History at Monmouth University, and I provide tech support for the PPG Zooms. So if you have any technical issues throughout the evening, please feel free to drop me a line in the chat. With that, I will turn things over to Princeton Preservation Group's president and longtime Monmouth County archivist and Rutgers internship coordinator. And I could go on and on and on, but Gary Soretsky.
Thanks very much, Melissa. And thank you for doing the work that you do to make these programs possible, including recording them and making them available subsequently on the Monmouth University's website. Princeton Preservation Group started 40 years ago. It began in the living room of a preservation librarian at Rutgers named Susan Swartzberg. And then the meetings got too large for her living room and we started meeting elsewhere. And we met in person until the pandemic. And since then, we've been meeting on Zoom, and our plans are to continue doing that because it's enabled people from a wide geographic area to attend, as well as to have speakers who are not local. We meet on a very broad range of preservation topics, preservation of all sorts of cultural materials, as well as preserving history, as in tonight's presentation about doing oral history. We have a webpage where you can find more information about PPG, including a list of all the past meetings. And there's a place if you want to become a member. The dues are $5 a year, and that gets you on the mailing list for members only events, which will happen occasionally in the future. It's my pleasure now to introduce Julia Fell. She's the curator of exhibits and oral history at the Museum of Bethel Woods, which is the site of the 1969 Woodstock Music and Art Fair, which I was pleased to attend for about 18 hours during the festival. A graduate of the Cooperstown Graduate Program, she was trained in oral history methods and developed a firm belief in the importance of first-person narratives in history. She began implementing oral history at the museum during her first year there in 2018 and has been the lead curator of the program since 2020. To date, she and her team have recorded over 300 interviews, which is an incredible number of interviews in such a short period of time. So it's my pleasure to turn this over to Julia. Welcome.
Thank you, Gary, so much for inviting me to participate. And thank you, all of you who are here tonight to join us. Gary gave a pretty great introduction about my background, so I am just going to jump into my presentation. I can already tell my computer is a little unhappy with me and the fans are going hard, so if we run into any technical problems, I do apologize in advance and we'll just try to work through them. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. I'm just going to get my presentation into presentation mode there. And I also want to make sure that I can share sound because there is a video that I'm going to attempt to play and hope it doesn't crash everything in just a little while. All right, so without any further ado, I would like to get started by imparting to you a phrase that has become very central to our philosophies about the oral history program at the museum at Bethel Woods, which is that Woodstock is not just one story, it's 450,000 stories. There are 450,000 attendees at the Woodstock Music and Art Fair in 1969. And what we have come to learn is that each and every one has their own story that is significant in its own way. There is not a single interview that goes by where we don't learn something new or get a different perspective on Woodstock. So we want to keep that in mind as we go through our presentation today. And for those of you who aren't familiar, I did want to go over a little bit of information about the museum at Bethel Woods. Our mission is to interpret the social and political history, popular culture, and lasting influences of the 1960s through exhibitions, programming, historic preservation, research, and collections. And that background image there is from our main exhibition, Woodstock in the 60s. We have a reproduction 1960s painted bus, which is definitely one of the focal points of the museum. The museum was opened in 2008 as part of Bethel Woods Center for the Arts, and it is located on the National Register Historic Site of the 1969 Woodstock Music and Art Fair in Bethel, New York, not Woodstock, New York, which confuses people sometimes. We have a whole host of programming, which includes exhibitions, specialized tours, adult education, landscape preservation, and the reason for us being here tonight, our oral history initiative. And again, I'm going to repeat that key phrase that Woodstock is not just one story, it's 450,000 stories. Each individual who attended the festival truly does have unique perspectives, feelings, and memories, and we aim to bring those out with each interview. Our goal is to capture as many of these 450,000 as possible. And I will get a little bit more into our strategy and motivations behind the project after this video, which fingers crossed will not disrupt the presentation too much. And please do let me know if there's any issues with the audio here.
My name is Jan Hauser, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Allison Goodrich, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Greg Dewey, and I played at Woodstock.
My name is Alan Frischman, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Judy Kiffner-Wolf, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Tisha Ackery, and I worked at Woodstock.
My name is Reverend Robert Schrader, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Akinyele Sadik, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Linda Hall, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Betty Small, and I was at Woodstock.
And my name is Jerry Small, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Maxine Stone, and I was on stage at Woodstock.
My name is Paula Roos, and I came to Woodstock.
My name is Norman Gaines, and I really was at Woodstock.
My name is Lydia Ruth Gaines, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Don Matuzis, and I was at Woodstock.
My name is Stephen Brown, and I was at the Woodstock Music and Art Fair.
My name is Jennifer Brown, and I was also at Woodstock with him.
All right, we made it through without my presentation crashing. But I hope you enjoyed that video, which is representative of just some of the interviews that we collected between 2020 and 2021. We have since collected several hundred more, and we'll probably do an updated version of that video before too long. But I like to show that video because it helps to show just the diverse perspectives, diverse people of all different backgrounds who attended Woodstock and who were eager to share their stories with us, from attendees to staff members to performers. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is some of the motivations behind doing that project. Aside from the emotional impact that we just got to experience from that video, there were also some logistical and strategic advantages to focusing on oral history. So as you may know, the Woodstock Festival celebrated its 50th anniversary back in 2019, which was really a banner year for us, an incredible experience to get to be a part of. But once that was over, we were at sort of a turning point and realized, what is our legacy post 50th anniversary? What are we going to leave behind at Woodstock's 100th anniversary? You know, what can we provide during this time period that no one else is working on and that no one else will have access to do? Also, what opportunities are we going to miss if we don't act now? We also had to cope with the fact that COVID-19 had rapidly changed our world in 2020. So directly following one of our biggest years ever, in fact, our biggest year ever at the museum at Bethel Woods, we had our most challenging year. So we had to look at what programming could be done remotely, how we could engage with people in a meaningful way during this very difficult time. And we also had to realize that ourselves, as well as many of our constituents, were confronting their mortalities and legacies for the first time. Which brings us to our next motivation, which is the unstoppable march of time. Some of you may recognize the man in the background image there is Michael Lang, one of the 4 principal Woodstock organizers who we just lost just over a year ago now at the beginning of 2022. His loss has really reverberated throughout the Woodstock community and has reminded us that our opportunities to catch these stories are slipping away. And luckily, Michael was interviewed several times before his passing, but there are plenty of people out there who haven't been. The average age of a Woodstock attendee is over 70 years old at this point, and we only have a limited window before those stories will be gone forever. We also have a population of museum attendees and constituents who are looking at their end-of-life planning at this stage, and we need to be ready for their desire to record their legacy. So the interview process we'll get into now. Once we decided to do the project based on all those motivations, we had to develop a process. So the first step is reaching potential narrators. And there are several ways that we do that. One is our Woodstock Alumni Registry, which is an online survey available on our website. And one way that we encourage people to fill out that survey is by handing out these Alumni Registry cards, which are available in the museum. Our staff people who are at our welcome desk and who work in our lobby, as well as our museum volunteers, are encouraged to carry these with them, because oftentimes people will come to the museum, say, oh, I was at Woodstock, this is my first time back in over 50 years. And without the opportunity to hand them something to follow up on that story with, those stories are often lost as well. So we've seen a pretty good return on using these cards to encourage people to reach out to us online through that survey. So we market the Alumni Registry, we market the Oral History Program, and we also have a dedicated email address, which I could have put on this slide. It's oralhistory@themuseum@bethelwoods.com. I can share that certainly after the presentation. So we have those channels through which people can reach out to us. We also do our own research and outreach. We reach out to people, do cold calls, cold emails all the time. And that is how we reach some of our narrators. We also work with people who we refer to as community connectors, and I want to save our talk about that for a little bit later in the presentation, but we do work with some community liaisons. The next step of the interview process for us is to set up the interview, and that involves consistent communication. As I mentioned, sometimes we are reaching out to these people with a cold call or email, so it's really critical to be clear and concise with what we are asking of a person when we invite them to participate in the project. I will often explain in our emails what an oral history it consists of, which for us is about a 45-minute long interview that can be done over Zoom, over the phone, or in person at the museum. It's important to not only set a date for these interactions, for these interviews, but to set expectations. As unlike with many oral history processes, I am meeting the person that I'm interviewing for the very first time in the interview. The next step is, of course, conducting the interview, which includes setting up the space, either physical or virtual. We do have a space in the museum that we use for interviews, a sort of makeshift studio with, we have access now to a professional video camera as well as lighting equipment. You may have seen in that My Name Is video that we actually use an enlarged version of the Woodstock site map as our backdrop. If we are setting up a Zoom call, it involves simply pinning the narrator's window so that that is what is recorded. And I will make a note here that I have had to come to terms with the fact that the recording on Zoom is not going to be perfect, and that a person's background is going to be authentic to their person, to their home, to their office, whatever it may be. And that's what we've embraced, is the authenticity of the virtual interview process. Just as when we get a little bit down the road with the transcription, we tend to choose to leave in the ums, ahs, patterns of speech. We've embraced authenticity all the way through. The next step in the interview process, once we've gotten the person either in our physical space or into a Zoom room, is to collect their permissions and vital information for our record. And that includes things like how they say and spell their name, where they currently reside. And we also will have them say that sentence, my name is so-and-so, and I was at Woodstock. For Woodstock attendees, we have a standard set of questions that we operate off of. Although, of course, oral history is a time for active listening and improvisation. There are a lot of follow-up questions that will happen during an interview based on the information that that person chooses to share. The post-interview process consists of some follow-up communications, and this allows for an extended line of communication if the narrator has any questions after the fact, that they are welcome to reach out. I always make sure to let them know that. This is also the time at which I will share our release form so that we have permission to use the interview aside from adding it to our archives. We do our file management. Everything currently is hosted on our internal servers at the museum. And we have our own way of organizing that for the time being. And the final step is the transcription process. Now, in order to do that, I used to do everything completely by ear. And if any of you have had any experience with transcription, you know how painful and time consuming that can be. But luckily, we discovered a program called Descript, which uses artificial intelligence to run through an audio file and do a rough first pass of a transcription, which we can then go back and edit. It has saved us a tremendous amount of time, which isn't to say that oral history transcription isn't still a time-consuming process and that we aren't maybe a little further behind on it than we'd like to be. But Descript works very well, and I highly recommend the program. So that was our basic process for the first year and a half of the program. And with all of that progress, we also had some challenges and lessons that we needed to look at. The greatest of which that I'd like to share with you today is diversity and representation in the program. Now, I took some statistics, to the best of my ability from the year 1969 to best represent the population of people who would have attended Woodstock. Although for statistics of people who identify with the LGBT plus community, there are no statistics available for 1969. So those statistics are from 2022. As you can see across the board, our representation within our collection does fall short of the representation within the general population of the United States. So that is something that we are actively working on trying to correct. Even I'm surprised the statistic of female interviewers or interviewees, in our program is pretty significantly smaller than the number of male interviewees, especially when looking at the fact that the population of the United States in 1969 was over 50% female. What I will say is that the trends that we are seeing in people who approach us for interviews is pretty similar to the national trends in museum visitorship and engagement, which tends to swing towards white, middle class, straight identifying folks. And it's not surprising really that the people who are approaching us are from those demographics. So with all of that in mind, we had to figure out how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to try to level the playing field there and connect with people from other demographics? And this is where we entered into some of our experimental programming. Now, I have two parents for teachers, and so I was blessed with looking at things from an educational perspective. And after getting experience with this oral history program, realized that what we weren't doing was meeting people where they are. Now, this is a philosophy that I was familiar with from hearing my parents talk to each other about meeting students where they are when they weren't seeing outcomes that were expected. And so with the outcomes that I expected not being met, I decided I needed to follow the same philosophy. In order to meet people where they are, there's a few things that we can do, and we needed to test some concepts before we took it to a greater level. And to do that, we hosted a proof of concept program at the Woodstock Monument on our site. We selected the monument because although it is on our property, it is seen as a much more neutral location than the museum building itself. There are tons of people who visit our site annually who feel comfortable going to the historic site and to the monument itself, but who aren't comfortable going into the institution itself, into the museum building. So we decided that there was a whole audience of people out there who we were missing out on connecting with right in our own backyard, and we decided to test our program there. And we were lucky enough, I should mention, that this program was funded by a grant from the Museum Association of New York. And the program was a raging success. It was far more successful than we could have anticipated. We hosted the program over 6 days, spread out through the months of July and August, and we collected 54 new interviews. This group of interviews was also way more diverse than any before and included narrators of diverse races, ethnicities, national origins, sexualities, genders, and ages. It was really mind-blowing what happened when we just took a little step outside of our front door to meet people where they felt more comfortable and where they felt like they had a more of a balance of power. Along with those successes, though, of course, we did have challenges and lessons to learn from that experience. The first of which, and probably the foremost of which, is that conducting that number of oral histories in a short period of time is exhausting for both the narrators and the interviewers. So things that we took away from that experience is that it's crucial to have interviewers taking turns, to have multiple interviewers in the first place, and to be able to switch off. We also need additional support staff and volunteers to help gather the narrators and liaise with them while they are waiting for their turn to be interviewed. And we also need to schedule decompression time in between interview slots, because if any of you have had experience doing any sort of interviewing as the interviewer or the interviewee, you may know that it can become quite emotional, and all that active listening on the part of the interviewer really does take a mental toll that you need to recuperate from, at least for a little while. So with all that in mind, the proof of concept done and the challenges and lessons learned from, we were ready to take these pop-up programs to the next level. We started at the end of last year with a pop-up program in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a countercultural hub we were eager to get into. We also did some programming in Miami, Florida in January of this year. And we are taking the show on the road for real, starting at the end of March. My supervisor and I are going on a themed cruise, the Flower Power Cruise, a captive audience of people who really care about the 1960s. We're then taking the program to Columbus, Ohio, where we're going to meet with the organizers of ComFest, a music festival which started in 1970 and was directly influenced by Woodstock. We're then going to Los Angeles and San Francisco in April and May to meet with the countercultural hubs in those areas. And that's just what we have planned so far. There are definitely more yet to come. I also want to take this moment to mention that this slate of travel programs is funded by a federal grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And now I'd like to talk a little bit more about those community connectors that I mentioned earlier in the program. These community liaisons who have helped us connect with groups of people who we otherwise might not have had access to. Our first community connector who we worked with in Santa Fe is Lisa Law, who is a former Hog Farm Commune member and renowned photographer. She is a staple of the Santa Fe community and was able to help us garner over 40 interviews during our time there, with many leads to follow up on. She has access to people who are still participating in the communal and countercultural lifestyle who otherwise wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable speaking with people representing an institution. Our next community connector is Rona Elliott, who is a former Woodstock staff member and still has connections with a lot of people within that circle, as well as within the countercultural community in Los Angeles. Andy Basista is a ComFest staff member who has connected us with a wonderful group of people in Ohio. And Stephen Palmer is an oral historian, professionally trained from Columbia, who has a specialty in counterculture and LGBTQ communities. He also operates in Bethel, New York City, and has a specialty in San Francisco. And that's just phase 1, 2023. We also are hoping to bring this project into a phase 2 pending grant funding, and that will focus on New York State and New York City. We'll be bringing some more specialty into this program with a partnership with the American LGBTQ+ Museum, as well as representatives who can help us connect with more narrators from the African American community, such as Dr. Gretchen Soren of the Cooperstown Graduate Program, and Rachel Marco Havens, who is the daughter of Woodstock performer Richie Havens, and she is also involved in many activist communities. She lives in Woodstock, New York, and also has connections in New York City. We'd also be bringing back Stephen Palmer for more of that connection with the LGBTQ community in New York. So we are definitely working with those folks from phase 1 and are well on our way to working with a new set of community connectors for phase 2. So to sum up some of our successes from our oral history program in general, as well as our experience so far with these experimental pop-up programs, the numbers really don't lie. It's incredible the number of oral histories that we've been able to collect over the past several years, over 400 at this point. We anticipate reaching over 500 in 2023. The Meet People Where They Are philosophy has been very successful. As I mentioned previously, the Monument program yielded 54 short form interviews. The Santa Fe program gave us 42 longer form interviews, with many to follow up on over Zoom. And we are set to collect at least 150 new interviews with pop-up programming throughout the rest of 2023, as well as our regular everyday programming that we host over Zoom or in person at the museum throughout the year. So what's next for the program? As I've been saying all along, we are part of the way through our 5-year planned collecting initiative. So for now, what's next is simply more interviews. We're going all in on collection right now. But after that, we do have a longer term plan to moving into an archival phase, where we hope to build a database of oral histories that will be available to the public one day. For now, keep an eye out for excerpts and quotes from current oral histories in our special exhibits and programming at the museum. And I want to thank you for joining me tonight. And I do want to encourage, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Julia. Melissa, I think perhaps you might have some questions for Julia to start us off.
Sure. I'd be happy to kick things off. I'd also note everyone has the ability to unmute themselves if they'd like to ask a question, or you can type it in the chat and I'm happy to read it for you. So here's a question in the chat. So let me take one from the audience first. It just popped up as I said that. Here we go. Marianne asks, do you plan on posting the written transcript or the transcript plus the audiovisual recording?
That is a great question. The short answer is that we do eventually plan on sharing those things. That will be part of the archival phase and that database building phase that we won't be working on for another couple of years yet, as we really focus for the next 2.5 years on the collecting phase. But that is in our long-term planning. And of course, if you are interviewed for the project, you are able to access your own personal transcript.
I would just add on to that. Are you having everybody edit their own transcripts?
No, but that would be fabulous. I have had one person who wanted to do that, and people typically aren't super interested, but I would be happy to let somebody work on their own transcript if they wanted to.
I know oral historians have different feelings about that, because you create the transcript and it's a reflection of the interview as it unfolded, and then sometimes people move into heavy-handed edits and it just becomes a bit of a sticky wicket. So I was curious to hear what you thought about that.
Yes, it can be. I think if we were running into a lot more interest from people, I would have to think about parameters for how to handle that. But so far, it's just been one person who did a pretty good job. So not too much of an issue. I do sometimes run a program for our museum volunteers to help with the transcription, which has documentation and templates and things to follow, so that they are able to do the transcription to our standard.
Great. Here's another question from the chat. What is the most surprising thing you have learned from your interviews?
Oh, I love this question. It's not easy to answer because there's a lot of different answers, but I do love addressing it. So a question that I ask often, and I don't even always ask it because I really care about a yes or no answer to it, but the question that has yielded the most interesting results is, do you think Woodstock could ever happen again? And I have gotten a surprising variety of answers to that question, although I will say most people say no. But the answers that it yields, the reasons why people think Woodstock can't happen again, are very interesting, very revealing about each person and about people's general thoughts and feelings about where we've come to since the 60s, where we are now as a society, as well as people's faith in the younger generations, which as a millennial is sometimes a little bit difficult to sit and listen to with a straight face, but it is authentic and it is important to record those opinions.
Another question from the chat. What kind of questions do you typically start off with the interviewee?
I will always start a question off with some information about a person's life before Woodstock to try to get a general idea of what they were up to at that time. Woodstock, for some people, not everyone, but for some people was a pretty life-changing event. So I want to get a baseline of what their life was like before that time. I feel like it also helps to ease people into the topic of Woodstock by just letting them think about, you know, was I in school? Was I working? All of that stuff. And then we'll lead into some questions about how did you hear about Woodstock? Who did you go with? How did you get there? And then we'll get into the real meat of their festival experience.
Okay, another question from the chat. The chat is on fire. How can someone sign up for an oral history session? And maybe we could drop that in the chat if that's not.
Yes, actually, I will type in the chat myself right now. The best way to get in touch with us is to contact us at our dedicated oral history email address, which is oralhistory@bethelwoodscenter.org. That is a direct line to our email address that we use for communicating about oral history. I check that daily. And that is where you'll want to go. I will also put right now a link to our alumni registry. So if you know somebody who is at Woodstock, you're not sure if they'd want to commit to doing a full interview, but they just want to put their feelers out, you can send them this link, bethelwoodscenter.org/alumni, and that will have access to our alumni registry survey.
Okay. And another one from the chat. What do you hope to learn and take away from this Princeton Preservation Group session? That's interesting.
Well, it's good for me to hear your questions and find out what the public is interested in with regards to the oral history project. That way, when we do move into that archival phase, that project of creating that database that we hope to get to in the next couple of years, we will have a much better idea of what the public is interested in seeing from us.
Okay, so that's the end of the questions currently in the chat. Feel free to go ahead and type some more or unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. You're free to do that.
Well, I'll ask one. To what extent have the oral history interviews impacted the displays at the museum to date? And how do you see that going forward?
Yes, they certainly have impacted how we do our exhibitions and our programming as well. I would say almost to a greater extent, our public programming. We have really ramped up our public programming offerings recently, and the Oral History Initiative has allowed us to go down some really interesting research routes that we might not have even known about previously. Like I keep saying, Woodstock's 450,000 different stories, 450,000 different puzzle pieces to the greater picture of Woodstock. And without collecting those puzzle pieces, there are parts of that picture that we just wouldn't know about. So by collecting these interviews, we're able to find out information and make connections that we wouldn't have made otherwise. So for example, one of our historic preservation, our landscape preservation efforts is our Bindi Bazaar Woods. And that is a wooded area on our campus that during the time of Woodstock had a series of trails running through it. Along those trails were vendor booths where artisans and crafters could sell their goods. That's been a major research focus. And without oral histories, we would know far less about that area and how to restore and activate it than we do now, or than we did before.
I noticed when I was at the museum that there was at least one movie where they had a narration that was from an oral history. It was a woman who said that she was probably one of the few people who were not high on drugs while she was at Woodstock, and that she was high on the music, something to that effect. I thought that was a very interesting excerpt.
I'm so glad you specifically mentioned that quote, because it makes me laugh every time. You wouldn't believe the number of people I've spoken with who say they were the only person at Woodstock who wasn't doing drugs. It's so many people. I've come to the not data backed up conclusion. I have to do some more studying on that, but I've come to the opinion that there were actually more people at Woodstock who weren't doing drugs than they were doing drugs. Everyone was contact high.
That's funny.
And to answer your question, the way that oral histories have impacted videos, those displays in the main exhibit were actually part of an initial burst of oral history collecting that was done when the museum was developed back in between 2006 and 2008. And then we really didn't focus on that for about over 10 years. So our revamped oral history program is kind of going back to those roots. We are also going to be reaching 20 years of the museum being open before too long. And we are definitely planning on including the newer updated oral histories and any revamped media that will go into our updated exhibit when that happens.
Sounds good. The museum is wonderful. If you folks haven't been there, I recommend going, even if you didn't attend Woodstock. It's a really interesting place.
I didn't go, and I find it pretty interesting.
Julia, I'm curious, are there other folks out there doing Woodstock oral history collection? And if so, how is your project different from those?
The short answer to that is that, yes, there are some people doing Woodstock interviews. We know for sure that there are lots of folks who have interviewed the Woodstock performers, for example. That's been a hot topic. Other museums like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame have definitely collected interviews from those folks. What makes our project different is that while we are interested in connecting with the kind of heavy hitters of Woodstock, the performers and whatnot, we are far more focused on the stories of the regular people, the attendees. The most of the 450,000 people at Woodstock were attendees, and we want to be able to shine a light on those voices.
Oh, I love that so much. Here's another question from the chat. What is the size of your staff collecting and working on the oral history project? Is it just you and a person editing the transcripts?
I do the interviews and edit the transcripts. We have a pretty small staff. We have 4 full-time staff members. Myself and my supervisor, who is the museum director, are primarily the people doing the interviews. We do also host a series of internships in partnership with the Cooperstown Graduate Program. So at any one time, I will have generally 1 intern working with me. I host a remote internship for a CGP student in the spring and fall, and then we do a full-time in-person internship in the summer. So those interns also do interviews, and they will take that process from the communication phase all the way through the transcription phase. We see for the in-semester internships about 5 completed interviews per intern and about 10 for the summer intern. But it's mostly me. My supervisor, as we've done these pop-up programs, has become a lot more involved, and we've really, as a team, gone all in on the interviewing. So I have a lot more support from him as well this year and in the foreseeable future.
Awesome. Another question from the chat. Does Descript work with a zip file or other media? Also, is the service pricey? I come from a small historical society, and we are starting to interview long-term residents of the community.
Wonderful question. I'm so happy to talk about Descript a little bit more. I would say it's a pretty reasonable service. There is, I believe, a free version. I'm not sure if it's free year-round or a free trial, but you can get a certain number of hours of transcription in without having to pay anything at all. After that, we do pay an annual subscription. I think there's also a monthly offering. I think our annual subscription is only about $120 a year. It's really quite affordable. It will handle different file types. We typically will put either MP3 audio files or .wav audio files into it. If you have something that's been compressed into a zip file, I think you can probably extract it from the zip file and put it into Descript. Descript also can handle videos. If you want to put an MP4 or a .mov video file into the program, it will transcribe from there. I've just found it takes a lot longer. So if you have an extracted audio file, that tends to be more streamlined.
I've not used Descript, but I would just note I always use rev.com when I am fortunate enough to have funding because rev.com creates a beautiful, almost perfect verbatim transcript and fast. I do not know what magic they work in order to do that, but rev.com has been just a lifesaver for me.
We experimented with using Rev as well, and we're using Rev for our audio only, our phone call recorded interviews for a while. What I found is that although it does provide a beautiful transcript like you described, it's kind of cost prohibitive because it's like $30 to $35 per interview, I think. Descript is a lot more cost effective, and I would say is fairly accurate as well. And if you you can export the file to Microsoft Word if you prefer to edit that way, but Descript also does have a lot of keyboard shortcuts that you can use to edit within the program that I find help make it a little bit faster.
I definitely look forward to playing around with that. Always looking for, people always say, surely there's got to be some software that can automatically transcribe. And
yes,
it's harder than you think. We keep getting closer, but it's
hard.
Because
and Zoom does kind of an awful job. The Zoom auto transcript is not where I would like it to be. I actually found out about Descript because a good friend of mine was starting to produce a podcast and was concerned about having captions for accessibility reasons, which is also a concern for us as well. And one of the reasons we really do want to do transcripts for everything. So I found out about it from somebody who was doing podcasting. And I know that people who do podcasting as well as video production will use Descript to do their accessibility captioning.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Other questions?
Hi, this is Mike Andrick. This is sort of a possibly long-winded question, but has nothing to do with your oral histories, though, which is fascinating. I'm at an institution where we would be unlikely to have something like this, but we do have an audio recording that somebody at one point suggested could be like a bootleg recording from Woodstock.
Okay.
Do such things exist? Would there be any way to verify it?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean exactly by bootleg. We do know and have some in our collection, home videos. There's lots and lots of home videos, not as many as we have photographs, of course, but people did have personal recording devices and some shot film. So
by bootleg, I basically meant something amateur made that was just done other than by like a professional audio person who would have been possibly near the stage or connected to the system or somehow.
Yes, yeah. So if you have a way of sharing that with us, the email address that I dropped in the chat there, the oral history address, you can reach us there, and we can find out a way of reviewing that footage. And I'm positive that
this is audio only. Yeah, this is audio only. There's
audio only.
Yeah.
That would be a little bit harder. We do use visual cues a lot for authenticating things, but it's always worth a try, and we're always happy to take a look at what might be the next big clue on our Woodstock journey.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Julia, how often do hidden treasures kind of pop up? I mean, is it a constant thing where people are cleaning out their parents' attics or basements? I mean, how common is, something like Michael's quarry?
All the time, especially now, for some of the reasons that I mentioned in our motivations for the oral history project, where people are getting older and their relatives are passing away, or they're simply just thinking about their end of life plans. And especially after the 50th anniversary, where people were having their memories jogged about Woodstock quite a bit, we do have a lot of people who have artifacts at home that they would like to donate to the museum. We do have, again, just with the oral histories, people thinking about their experiences, wanting to share. And aside from artifact gems, honestly, the oral histories have provided some research gems and just some little bits of information that are critical to us understanding the layout of the historic site or how something functioned operationally. It's these little things that we do see practically every single day.
Okay, any last questions from the audience? Gary, how about you?
Julia, I think you did a marvelous job covering all the information without
Thank you.
telling us what each individual person had to say. I know you had to kind of summarize it, but I mean, what are your impressions of Woodstock? You didn't attend it, obviously, but you've certainly heard more about it than almost anybody who didn't attend.
I will say it's a little bit strange being in my position of expertise, basically about Woodstock, which as such a young person is kind of crazy to say, but my impressions of Woodstock are very hard to sum up, but that it was a marvelous thing, that it brought hope to so many people of that generation, of the boomer generation, and that it's continued to do that. People will often ask me, how did I get involved in doing this? And, my answer is, well, just like anyone else, I was, looking for work, but I had been to the museum as a teenager at 15 years old, and it really did leave an impression on me. And when it was time for me to start looking for a job, I jumped at the opportunity to investigate what that would look like at Bethel Woods. I went through a Woodstock phase as a teenager, for sure. There's embarrassing pictures of me wearing a Woodstock t-shirt on my first day of 10th grade. And I remember the flower power, renaissance that happened when I was a little kid. So I think the 60s in Woodstock really are still with us in a lot of ways, ephemeral and not. And I'll flip, maybe in closing here, I'll flip that question I mentioned earlier on its head. I ask people, do you think Woodstock could ever happen again? Why or why not? Sometimes the narrator will flip that question and ask it to me. And the answer that I've started using and that I truly believe in is that aside from each generation sort of having its own Woodstock, and I won't get into what we think that is because everyone has their own opinion, but I think there are seminal events that take place for each generation. If we're looking at the 1960s Woodstock, the Woodstock that has imparted to us the lessons of peace and love and getting along with your neighbor and all of these things that we aspire to, I think it's happening every day. I think, are we ever going to have a concert with the biggest acts of the time and 450,000 people and mud and rain and not enough food? And I mean, I kind of hope not, but I think that the spirit of Woodstock and the things that it inspires in us are happening in little ways all the time. And whether you were there and you carry that with you from personal experience, or whether you're like me and you've heard the stories and feel inspired that way, there's ways for us to make Woodstock happen every day.
Have you ever had anyone compare it to Burning Man or compare Burning Man to Woodstock?
Not really, not really. People are more quick to compare it to the revival festivals from the 90s. Some people enjoyed those festivals, some people didn't. That's a comparison that gets drawn more frequently. I think a lot of people who went to Woodstock didn't go to that many more music festivals later in life. So things like Burning Man, people from the boomer generation haven't necessarily experienced. They have gone to a lot of concerts, concerts of those musicians from the 1960s, but not necessarily festivals like Burning Man or Coachella.
Yeah, Burning Man is not a music festival. Coachella is, and it's just interesting if there were any people that had been to Woodstock and had been
right. Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. Burning Man's not a music festival per se, but I think a lot of folks who went to Woodstock haven't really participated in gatherings, we'll say, of that nature since.
Thank you.
Great questions from our audience. Anything else from the audience? Well, Julia, that was awesome. I loved learning about your collection, your work specifically, but also just this discussion about how oral history can be used to help us understand the past, whether it's social movements or the built environment or anything. Oral history can help us really fill in holes in the historical record and put a human face on history in a really unique way. So thank you so much. Gary, any last thoughts from you before we wrap?
Just like to mention that PPG will be having more programs this year. We're hoping to have one on exhibits and the preservation aspects of exhibits, like how to prevent damage during exhibits of materials on display. And in the fall, we're going to have a program about mold on paper. And that I've seen the presentation already, actually, and it's going to be really interesting with wonderful illustrations. So if you're interested in these things, hope you'll join us for future meetings.
Okay, so we're good, Gary. We're calling it a night.
Yep.
All right. Thank you again, Julia. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And we hope to see you at the next event. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.